Hi, I'm Emily from Life So Savory, and today I'm going to show off a really fun women's tank top pattern. I love this pattern because of the panel features, which lends itself really well to pattern and fabric mixing. So you can take a look at this finished one. There's actually two pieces to the front, and on this one I used the same fabric, but on this one that I'm going to be making today I've used two different fabrics. Then we also have the back panel, which has three different pieces, and you can either put different patterns of your fabric, or today I'm using a knit fabric and a stretch eyelet fabric to make a panel on the back. You can also do some fun top stitching detail with your cover stitch, and that's what I'm going to be demonstrating today. So let's take a look at how we put this together. Again, the front is two different pieces, and I'll be sewing that, and the back is three different pieces to create a fun paneled back. So let's move over to the sewing machines and put this together. All right, so I'm using a serger sewing machine here to sew the back panel together, and we have two different opposite curves on the back panel. So I've already got this clipped together, and I'm going to be easing those curves together as I sew. The settings are generally just regular settings for the serger. I did tighten up the thread tension just a little bit because I have a really thin knit here and it's pretty stretchy. So I want to make sure that it all sews together really evenly. So we're going to begin sewing, and again I'm easing two opposite curves, so I have to make sure that I'm going pretty slow, and I actually stop pretty often to make sure that that fabric is easing together and that those curves are lining up perfectly. I'm not really cutting off too much as I sew, but the seam allowance is included on this pattern. So just trimming off a little bit as I go around, again easing those curves together. And we're going to continue stitching all the way up the back of the tank top. Just removing my clips as I get to them, but using them to keep those angles and the curves together. I like using clips on this instead of pins. It helps keep the fabric from stretching out, and it doesn't distort any of the pattern or the curve while I'm sewing. Especially with knit fabric, that's a really handy tip. All right, so now our back piece is all put together. You can see I sewed this one at home in the darker thread, and then I just did this one. So we've got the panels put together on the back, and I'll be top stitching this on the cover stitch as soon as we finish our front piece. So now the front is also in two pieces, and we're going to sew these two panels together. This one will go quicker because it's just a straight stitch across the front. You could also combine these two pieces into one if you don't want panels on your front of your tank top. I like the little added variety, but it's definitely a pattern piece that you could merge. You want to make sure when you're sewing with the serger that you're not pulling or stretching the fabric. You want it to glide easily through the machine, but not distort the fabric. I'm using white thread just so it's really easy to see for this purpose, but normally I would probably use a dark thread so that it doesn't show through on this fabric at all. But this is easy for us to see. Okay, so now we have a completed front of the tank top, and you can see it's a little bit different than this one because this one I used the same fabric for both panels, but I thought I'd add a little more variety to this tank that we're sewing today. So now we're going to move to the cover stitch and do some top stitching to add that extra detail, which gives this tank a sporty look, yet also a casual design. A cover stitch machine is great for top stitching because it reinforces the seam, allows it to lay flat, and just gives that added extra detail. Now the serger cannot do what the cover stitch does because the serger actually slices your fabric while you're sewing, whereas the cover stitch is more of a top stitch or finishing machine. I want to make sure that I've got the presser foot up and then I shove my fabric in. I'm going to be stitching on the knit fabric, not on the stretch eyelet. We're going to continue stitching down the curve of the tank top. Again, we want to make sure that we're not stretching the fabric because this is knit, so it can stretch as we're sewing. So I definitely use my hands to guide, but I'm trying really hard not to pull at the same time. We're kind of easing around that curve. When you're finished sewing these knit top stitch, you also want to make sure that you give it a good press and then even a steam to make sure that you get that all laying nice and flat. All right, so now you can see we've got the top stitching done, and here is the top looper. And then you can also see that on the back, there's the back looper. So it's really enclosed and reinforced our seam nicely on the back, and then the front is just a fun detail that's added. If you don't want the looper and the kind of sporty look that goes with that, you can also just do a 2 or 3 needle cover stitch on the top. So we have our back panel done and our front panel done, and now we're going to continue to assemble the tank top over on the serger. So from here, I'm going to sew the shoulder seams, and then we'll do the side seams, and you'll actually be able to see the garment take shape. So I'm just going to clip these together to keep it in place. Now, if you want to do just one shoulder seam and then sew your binding on with an open neckline, that's an option that you can do. I like to do it both ways. Sometimes I'll do it in the circle, and then sometimes I'll do it with only one shoulder sewn. All right, so now we're going to stitch the shoulder seam. Again, we're using about a 3/8 inch seam allowance and stitching right across that shoulder. Okay, so just a nice little seam, and we'll do the other shoulder, and then our neckline will be finished. All right, so at this point, your garment will start to take shape. You'll be able to see the front and back, and then we'll be able to sew up those side seams. So I'm going to start by matching the underarms, and then I'm going to sew down the entire length of the side. I'm not as worried about matching the hem because you can always trim that up if one piece got longer than the other, but the thing that you do want to match on this particular tank top pattern is the seam from the front panel and the seam from the back panel should match up. So I'm just going to place one little clip there, and then as I sew down, I can make sure that those two seams are matching, because on the side, we actually want those to come together. And you can either top stitch on that front panel or not. All right, so starting at the underarm, we're going to stitch down the side seam. This is actually a really quick and easy sew, and especially if you're not adding some of the more fancy top stitching, it goes really quickly. So once I cut this out and I'm focused on it, I can sew the whole tank top in 15 to 20 minutes, start to finish. If you're adding some more detail, you might add 5 to 10 more minutes onto that, but once you've sewn it a couple times, it actually goes very quickly. All right, so now we have one side seam finished, and we'll do the other side, and then we'll be able to show you a mostly finished garment. Of course, you'd have to add the neck and the arm bindings, which I'm not demonstrating today, but we'll just take a quick look on the finished tank top as soon as I'm done with this side seam. All right, and now we're sewing the second side seam. Down the side, again, I want to make sure that I match up the front and back panel lines when I get to that point. we're almost to the bottom. Okay, so now we have a tank top that really actually looks like a tank top. You can see the front and the back. I did apparently cut my front quite a bit longer, so before I hemmed that, I would have to trim that up. But let's show you the front side. Okay, so here's that tank top without the arm bindings. And then we have the back side that we did top stitch, that one side of the back panel. And of course, we want to do the same on the other side, just like on this one. Now for the bindings, I've cut these 1.5 inches, and then you would just add this to your arm. You could also bind in the knit, but I wanted to do it in the eyelet for a contrasting fabric. So this is a 1.5 inch binding, folded over, attached, and then sewn around with the cover stitch for a great look. So here's an easy tank top that you can sew in not very long, an afternoon project with great results.